Sometimes the most powerful moments in life are the quiet ones. They happen when a father takes his son by the hand and walks him into a world far removed from palaces and privilege. They happen when a young boy puts on an apron, rolls up his sleeves, and learns that being born into royalty means nothing if you cannot feel the pain of those who have nothing at all. This is not just a story about a prince. This is a story about love that crosses generations. It is about a grandmother who died before her grandson could know her, but whose spirit lives in every act of kindness he will ever perform. It is about a father who promised himself that he would never let his mother's light fade from this world. And it is about a young boy standing at the beginning of a journey that will one day define what kind of king he becomes. The morning of December 2025 was cold in London. The kind of cold that makes you want to stay inside, wrapped in blankets, drinking something warm. But, in a modest building in central London, the staff and volunteers at the Passage Homeless Charity were not thinking about the cold. They were thinking about the work ahead of them. Christmas was coming, and that meant their annual Christmas lunch needed preparation. This lunch was not a small affair. It was a tradition that brought together people who had nowhere else to go during the holiday season. People who had lost their homes, their jobs, their hope. People who the rest of the world often chose to ignore. The Passage had been doing this work for decades. Founded in 1980 by Cardinal Basil Hume, it had grown into one of the largest resource centers for homeless and vulnerable people in the United Kingdom. Every day, staff and volunteers worked to provide food, shelter, health services, and support to those who needed it most. They helped people find housing. They helped people find jobs. They helped people find their way back to a life worth living. But, on this particular December morning, something special was about to happen. Something that would connect the present to the past in a way that made hearts swell with emotion. Prince William arrived early that morning with his eldest son, George, who was just 12 years old. They came without the fanfare that often accompanies royal visits. There were no crowds of photographers, no red carpets, no formal speeches. William had specifically requested that this visit remain low-key. He did not want the focus to be on him or his son. He wanted the focus to remain where it belonged, on the people who came to the Passage seeking help and on the incredible staff who dedicated their lives to serving them. When they walked through the doors, George looked around with wide eyes. He had been to many places in his young life. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral. He had met presidents and prime ministers. He had waved to crowds of thousands from balconies. But this was different. This building was simple. Practical. The walls were not decorated with priceless paintings. The floors were not covered in ancient rugs. Instead, there were bulletin boards with information about job programs. There were signs directing people to medical services. There was the smell of food being prepared in the kitchen and the sound of voices, some laughing, some quiet, filling the hallways. William placed his hand on his son's shoulder. He remembered the first time he had walked through these same doors. He had been 11 years old, just a year younger than George was now. His mother had been the one to bring him. Princess Diana, the woman who had changed the face of the British monarchy with her compassion and her refusal to accept that royal life meant staying removed from real human suffering. She had held his hand that day, just as he now held his son's shoulder. She had told him that what he was about to see would change him. And she had been right. The year was 1993 when Diana first brought William to the Passage. Britain was in the grip of an economic recession. Homelessness had reached levels not seen in decades. Every night, people slept in doorways and under bridges across London. The news reported on it occasionally, but, for most people, the homeless were invisible. They were something you walked past on your way to work. Something you tried not to make eye contact with. Something you wished would just go away. But Diana could not look away. She had been patron of Centrepoint, another charity focused on youth homelessness, since 1992. She had seen firsthand what happened when young people fell through the cracks of society. She had held the hands of teenagers who had run away from abusive homes. She had listened to the stories of young men and women who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. She had watched them struggle with addiction, with mental illness, with the crushing weight of being completely alone in the world. And she had decided that her sons needed to see this too. Not because she wanted to make them feel guilty about their privilege, but because she wanted them to understand that being royal meant nothing if you could not connect with the people you would one day serve. She wanted them to know that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserved dignity and respect. She wanted them to see that behind every statistic about homelessness was a human being with a story, with dreams that had been deferred, with potential that had been squashed by circumstances beyond their control. The visit to the passage in 1993 had been carefully arranged. Diana wanted William to have a real experience, not just a photo opportunity. So she had asked the staff to let him spend time with the people they served. She had asked them to let him help in the kitchen. She had asked them to let him sit and talk with the residents, to play games with them, to hear their stories directly. William remembered walking into the common area that first day and feeling overwhelmed. He had never been in a place like this before. His life up until that point had been one of extraordinary privilege. He lived in palaces. He traveled in private planes. He wore clothes that cost more than most people earned in a month. And, suddenly, here he was, surrounded by people who had nothing. People whose entire lives fit into a single bag. People who did not know where they would sleep the next night or where their next meal would come from. He had been nervous, he would later admit. He did not know what to say or how to act. He had been afraid of doing something wrong, of offending someone, of saying something that would reveal how little he understood about their lives. But Diana had known exactly how to handle the situation. She had started talking to people as if she had known them all her life. She had laughed with them, asked about their stories, admired photos they showed her, and made everyone feel like the most important person in the room. William had watched his mother work her magic, and, slowly, his nervousness had faded. One of the residents had asked him if he wanted to play chess. William had agreed, even though he was not particularly good at the game. They had sat together at a small table, moving pieces across the board, and the man had told William about his life. He had been a teacher once, he said. He had had a wife and children. But then, his wife had left him, and he had lost his job, and things had spiraled downward from there. One day, he had woken up and realized he had nowhere to go. That conversation had changed something in William. He had never thought about how quickly a life could unravel. He had assumed that homeless people had always been homeless, that they were somehow fundamentally different from people like him. But here was a man who had once been a teacher. Who had once had a family. Who had once had everything William took for granted. And, yet, through a series of unfortunate events, he had ended up here, in a homeless shelter, hoping for a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. Diana had watched her son during that chess game. She had seen the moment when understanding dawned on his face. She had known then that she had made the right decision in bringing him. This was not about making William feel bad about his wealth. It was about opening his eyes to the reality of the world he would one day help lead. It was about teaching him that compassion was not weakness but strength. It was about showing him that the true measure of a person was not what they had but what they were willing to give. After the chess game, Diana had taken William to the kitchen where volunteers were preparing food for the evening meal. She had rolled up her sleeves and started helping, and William had followed her lead. They had chopped vegetables together, stirred large pots of soup, and arranged plates of bread. The staff had been surprised at first. They were not used to royalty actually working alongside them. But Diana had insisted. She did not want to stand on the sidelines and watch. She wanted to be part of the effort. She wanted William to understand that charity was not about writing checks from a distance. It was about showing up. It was about getting your hands dirty. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who did this work every day. By the time they left the passage that evening, William was exhausted. But it was a good kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes from doing something meaningful. He had talked to a dozen people that day. He had learned their names, heard their stories, played games with some of them, and helped serve dinner to others. He had discovered that homeless people were not so different from anyone else. They had hopes and fears, memories and dreams. They laughed at jokes and worried about the future. They were human beings who had simply fallen on hard times. Diana had asked William what he thought as they drove back to the palace. He had been quiet for a moment, trying to find the right words. Finally, he had said that he had not expected everyone to be so happy. He had thought the shelter would be a sad place, full of sadness and despair. But, instead, he had found warmth and community and even joy. The people there had made him feel welcome. They had treated him not like a prince but like a young person who had come to help. Diana had smiled at that. She had told William that this was exactly what she had hoped he would learn. That happiness was not about what you had but about the connections you made with other people. That even in the most difficult circumstances, human beings found ways to support each other, to laugh together, to create moments of brightness in the darkness. She had told him that this was what being royal should be about. Not the ceremonies and the titles and the palaces, but the ability to use your position to bring attention to those who needed it most. To use your voice to speak for those who had been silenced by poverty and circumstance. That visit in 1993 had planted a seed in young William's heart. A seed that would grow over the following decades into a deep and abiding commitment to helping those experiencing homelessness. He would return to the passage many times over the years. He would become their patron in 2019, taking on the formal role that connected him officially to the charity his mother had introduced him to all those years ago. He would sleep rough on the streets of London to raise awareness. He would launch initiatives and programs designed to not just help individuals but to address the systemic issues that led to homelessness in the first place. But the most important thing that visit had done was change how William saw his role in the world. His mother had given him a gift that day. Not a material gift, but something far more valuable. She had given him perspective. She had shown him that his privilege came with responsibility. She had demonstrated that the walls of the palace did not have to be barriers separating him from the rest of humanity. They could be starting points for journeys outward, into communities where his presence could make a real difference. Now, more than 3 decades later, William stood in the same building with his own son. The memory of that first visit with his mother was so vivid it almost hurt. He could still hear her voice, still feel her hand guiding him forward, still see the way her face lit up when she talked to the people at the shelter. She had been gone for almost 30 years now, having died in that terrible accident in Paris when William was just 15 years old. But her spirit lived on in the work he continued to do. And, today, he was going to pass that spirit on to the next generation. George did not know his grandmother. He had been born 16 years after her death. Everything he knew about Diana came from photographs, from stories his father told him, from the documentaries and books that continued to be made about her remarkable life. He knew that she had been beautiful and kind. He knew that people had loved her in a way that went beyond the usual respect for royalty. He knew that his father still missed her terribly, even after all these years. But, knowing about someone and understanding them are two different things. George had never seen his grandmother in action. He had never witnessed the way she could walk into a room and make everyone feel seen and valued. He had never experienced the particular magic she possessed, the ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Until today, his grandmother had been more legend than reality, more image than person. William wanted to change that. He wanted George to understand Diana not through stories but through action. He wanted his son to feel what it was like to do the work Diana had dedicated her life to. He wanted George to discover for himself the profound satisfaction that came from helping others. And so he had arranged this visit to the passage, making sure that George would have the same kind of immersive experience that he himself had had all those years ago. The staff at the passage welcomed them warmly. They remembered Prince William's many visits over the years. They knew about his genuine commitment to their cause. And they were touched that he had chosen to bring his son, to continue the family tradition that Diana had started. The chief executive, Mike Clark, took a few minutes to explain to George what the charity did and why their work was so important. He told George about the thousands of people they helped each year, about the programs they ran to prevent homelessness before it started, about the support they provided to help people rebuild their lives. George listened intently. He asked questions that showed he was really thinking about what he was hearing. He wanted to know how people ended up homeless. He wanted to know what kinds of help they needed most. He wanted to know if the people who came to the passage ever managed to get back on their feet. Clark answered each question patiently, impressed by the young prince's genuine curiosity. He could see Diana's influence in the boy, even though they had never met. There was the same openness, the same desire to understand rather than simply observe. After the introduction, it was time to get to work. The Christmas lunch was just days away, and there was much to be done. George was given an apron and a task. He would help in the kitchen, just as his father had done 3 decades earlier, just as his grandmother had done before that. The kitchen staff showed him how to prepare vegetables, how to arrange serving trays, how to make sure everything was ready for the big day. George threw himself into the work with enthusiasm. He was not a stranger to hard work. Despite his privileged upbringing, his parents had always emphasized the importance of effort and dedication. At his school, Lambrook, he was known as a good student who took his responsibilities seriously. He played sports with determination and participated in activities with genuine engagement. But this was different. This was not about grades or goals or winning games. This was about doing something that would directly help people who were struggling. As he worked, George began to relax. The initial awkwardness he had felt upon arriving started to fade. The staff treated him like any other volunteer, giving him tasks and expecting him to complete them. They did not fawn over him or treat him with excessive deference. They simply included him in the work, and George responded to that inclusion with gratitude. He chopped Brussels sprouts and arranged Yorkshire puddings. He helped set out decorations for the Christmas lunch. He carried supplies from one room to another and asked what else needed to be done. William watched his son with pride swelling in his chest. He saw so much of Diana in George at that moment. Not just in his physical appearance, though George had inherited his grandmother's blue eyes and her particular way of smiling, but in his spirit. In the way he approached the people around him. In his willingness to be present, to engage, to work alongside others without any trace of entitlement. At one point, George paused in his work and looked around the kitchen. Staff and volunteers were moving efficiently, preparing food that would feed 150 people. The sound of chopping and stirring filled the air. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread made his stomach growl. He turned to his father and asked a question that would have made Diana proud if she could have heard it. He asked why more people did not know about places like this. He asked why homelessness was still such a big problem when there were people willing to help. He asked what more could be done. William took a moment before answering. These were not simple questions with simple answers. The issue of homelessness was complex, tangled up with mental health challenges, addiction, housing shortages, economic inequality, and dozens of other factors. But he also knew that his son was asking these questions from a place of genuine concern, not just intellectual curiosity. George wanted to understand because he cared. William explained that homelessness was one of those problems that society had struggled with for centuries. He talked about the efforts being made to address it, including his own Homewards initiative, which aimed to demonstrate that homelessness could be made rare, brief, and unrepeated. He talked about the importance of prevention, of helping people before they lost their homes rather than only stepping in after they were already on the streets. He talked about the need for more affordable housing, better mental health services, and stronger support systems for vulnerable people. But, most importantly, he talked about hope. He told George that the people at the Passage and other organizations like it proved every day that change was possible. That individuals could turn their lives around with the right support. That communities could come together to help those in need. That even problems as big and complicated as homelessness could be tackled if enough people were willing to put in the work. George absorbed all of this, his young mind working to understand the complexities his father was describing. He was at an age where the world was starting to seem more complicated than it had when he was younger. He was beginning to understand that being a good person was not just about being nice to people. It was about taking action. It was about using whatever power and privilege you had to make things better for others. Later that morning, there was a moment that would be captured in photographs and shared around the world. George was invited to sign the visitor's book at the passage. This was a tradition for important guests, a way of recording their support for the charity's work. But, for George, it was more than just signing his name. It was connecting himself to a legacy that stretched back through his father to his grandmother. When the book was opened for him, George saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, on the same page where he was about to sign, were two other signatures. One from his father, Prince William, written in the careful handwriting of an 11-year-old boy. And, next to it, another signature. Princess Diana. His grandmother had signed this same book, on this same page, more than 30 years ago. George stared at his grandmother's signature for a long moment. This was her handwriting. Her pen had touched this paper. She had stood in this same building, doing the same kind of work he was doing now. She had cared about the same people he was learning to care about. In that moment, Diana was not just a legend or a photograph or a story. She was real. She was present. She was connected to him through this simple page in a visitor's book. With careful deliberation, George signed his name next to his father's and his grandmother's. 3 generations of royal commitment to helping those in need, captured on a single page. Staff members who witnessed the moment found themselves unexpectedly moved. They understood the significance of what was happening. They understood that they were watching history being made, a young prince taking his first steps down a path that his grandmother had cleared decades ago. After signing the book, George spent more time talking with staff and volunteers. He heard stories about the people they helped. He learned about the challenges they faced in their work. He asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to the answers. The adults around him were impressed by his maturity, by his genuine interest in what they were telling him. This was not a young person going through the motions of a royal visit. This was someone who was truly engaged. One staff member would later recall that talking to George felt like talking to his grandmother. Not because he looked like her, though he did. But because he had the same quality of attention. When Diana talked to someone, she made them feel like they were the only person in the world. She listened not just with her ears but with her whole being. And, now, here was her grandson, displaying that same rare gift. William observed these interactions with quiet satisfaction. He had brought George here to teach him something important. But, watching his son, he realized that George had already learned the most important lesson. Not from this single visit, but from a lifetime of watching his parents treat everyone with respect and compassion. Kate and William had worked hard to raise their children with an understanding of their privilege and the responsibilities that came with it. They had talked to George, Charlotte, and Louis about homelessness and other social issues. They had tried to instill in them the values that Diana had instilled in William and Harry. And, now, William was seeing the results of that upbringing. George was not performing kindness. He was living it. He was not pretending to care about the people at the passage. He genuinely cared. And that genuine compassion was exactly what Diana would have wanted for her grandchildren. It was exactly what she had hoped to pass on when she first took William to that shelter in 1993. As the morning drew to a close, William gathered George for one final moment before they left. He took his son to see the video that the charity would share with the world, a glimpse of their visit that would show millions of people what they had done that day. In the video, George and William could be seen working side by side, preparing food, decorating for the Christmas lunch, talking with staff. It was a simple record of a meaningful morning, but William knew it would resonate with people around the world. He also knew that people would see Diana in that video. Not her physical presence, of course. She had been gone for nearly 30 years. But her spirit. Her legacy. The work she had started was continuing through her son and, now through her grandson. The chain of compassion she had forged was growing stronger with each generation. And William was determined to make sure that chain never broke. Before they left, William reminded George that what they had done that morning was just the beginning. There would be more visits, more opportunities to help, more ways to make a difference. Being born into the royal family meant that George would always have a platform, a voice that could reach millions of people. The question was how he would choose to use it. William told George about something Diana had once said. She had talked about how she wanted to make the monarchy a more compassionate institution. She had believed that royals should not be separated from the people they served by walls of protocol and tradition. She had insisted on walking among ordinary people, touching their hands, hearing their stories, sharing their pain and their joy. George did not remember his grandmother, but, in that moment, he understood her better than he ever had before. He understood that she had not just been a beautiful princess who attended parties and wore lovely dresses. She had been a warrior for compassion, someone who used her position to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. And, now that mission had been passed to him. The drive back from the passage was quieter than the drive there. George sat in the car, looking out the window at the streets of London passing by. He saw people hurrying to work, tourists taking photographs, vendors selling newspapers and coffee. But, now he also saw things he might not have noticed before. A man sitting in a doorway with a cardboard sign. A woman pushing a shopping cart full of belongings. The invisible people that society often chose not to see. George asked his father if they could come back to the passage again. Not just for special occasions like Christmas, but regularly. He wanted to do more. He wanted to learn more. He wanted to be part of the solution to the problems he had just learned about. William smiled at his son's request. It was exactly what he had hoped to hear. The seed that Diana had planted in him so many years ago had now been planted in George. And, with time and nurturing, that seed would grow into something beautiful. Something powerful. Something that could change the world. This was Diana's true legacy. Not the photographs or the fashion or the headlines. But, the compassion she had instilled in her children, and, through them, in her grandchildren. She had understood that real change did not happen through grand gestures or royal decrees. It happened through individual acts of kindness, through personal connections, through teaching the next generation to care about those who were suffering. And, now, 30 years after her death, her grandson was carrying that legacy forward. Prince George, future King of England, had put on an apron and helped prepare food for homeless people. He had signed his name next to his grandmother's in a visitor's book. He had taken the first steps on a journey that would define his life. The world watched and celebrated. Social media filled with comments about how wonderful it was to see Diana's legacy continuing. News programs ran stories about the royal visit, highlighting the connection between past and present. People who remembered Diana felt a swell of emotion seeing her grandson follow in her footsteps. But, for George, the most important thing was not the public reaction. It was the private understanding he had gained. He understood now why his grandmother had been so beloved. He understood why his father had dedicated so much of his life to helping others. And, he understood that he had a responsibility, a calling, a purpose that went far beyond the accidents of his birth. As the car pulled through the gates and, back toward the family's home, George made a silent promise to himself. He would never forget what he had learned that day. He would never stop working to help those in need. He would carry his grandmother's legacy forward, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because it was right. Because it was who he wanted to be. And, somewhere, perhaps, Princess Diana smiled. Her grandson had found his way to the same truth she had discovered so many years ago. That being royal was not about crowns and castles. It was about service and compassion. It was about standing with those who had nothing and helping them believe they could have everything. It was about love, the kind of love that does not stay locked behind palace walls but goes out into the world to heal and to help. This was the beginning of George's journey. But, it was also a continuation, a new chapter in his story that had started long before he was born. The story of a princess who changed everything. The story of a prince who kept her memory alive. And, now, the story of a young boy who would carry that precious flame into the future. The Christmas lunch at the Passage would go ahead as planned, serving 150 people who had nowhere else to go. Among the vegetables chopped in, the table set would be the work of a 12-year-old prince who had learned, on a cold December morning, what it truly meant to serve. And, in the visitor's book, 3 signatures on a single page would stand as testament to a legacy of love that refused to die. Diana's light was still shining. And, through George, it would shine for generations to come. The news of Prince George's visit to the Passage spread across the world like wildfire in the days that followed. Videos and photographs captured during the morning were shared millions of times on social media. Television news programs ran extended segments about the royal father and son. Newspapers from London to Los Angeles featured the story on their front pages. And, everywhere, the reaction was the same. People were moved. They were inspired. They were reminded of Princess Diana and the extraordinary impact she had made during her too short life. For the staff at the Passage, the attention was both welcome and overwhelming. They had been doing their work quietly for decades, helping thousands of people escape homelessness without much fanfare. Now, suddenly, the whole world was watching. Donations poured in from people who had never heard of the charity before. Volunteers signed up in record numbers. The waiting list for those wanting to help grew longer by the hour. Mike Clark, the chief executive, gave interviews to journalists from around the globe. He spoke about the charity's mission, about the challenges they faced, about the importance of preventing homelessness rather than just responding to it. But, inevitably, the conversation always returned to the royal visit. What had it been like to host Prince William and Prince George? What had they done during their time at the shelter? How did it feel to witness a grandson following in his grandmother's footsteps? Clark answered these questions patiently, understanding that the media attention was a powerful tool for raising awareness. He talked about how natural George had seemed during the visit, how he had thrown himself into the work without any hesitation. He described the moment when George signed the visitor's book next to his grandmother's signature, and how everyone present had felt the weight of that moment. He explained that the royal family's ongoing support meant more than any amount of money. It meant that people in positions of power actually cared about those who had been forgotten by society. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, the reaction to the visit was being carefully monitored. The communications team had expected positive coverage, but the outpouring of emotion exceeded even their optimistic projections. People were not just interested in the story. They were deeply moved by it. Something about seeing young George in that apron, working alongside his father, had touched a nerve in the public consciousness. Social media analysis showed that the most shared images were the ones connecting George to Diana. Side-by-side comparisons of Diana visiting the Passage in 1993 and George visiting in 2025 went viral within hours. People commented on the resemblance between grandmother and grandson, not just in physical appearance but in their manner, their engagement, their obvious compassion. The phrase that kept appearing in comments and captions was simple but powerful. Diana would be so proud. For William, these reactions brought a complicated mixture of emotions. He was glad that the visit had resonated with so many people. He was pleased that attention was being drawn to the issue of homelessness and to the work being done to address it. But he also felt the familiar ache that came whenever his mother was mentioned. Nearly 30 years since her death, and the wound still had not fully healed. He did not think it ever would. He remembered how his mother had prepared him for public life. She had always insisted that being royal was not just about ceremony and protocol. It was about connecting with people, understanding their struggles, using your position to make a real difference. She had taken him to homeless shelters and hospitals, to AIDS wards and refugee camps. She had shown him parts of the world that most princes never saw. And, through those experiences, she had shaped the man he would become. Now he was doing the same thing for George. Passing on the lessons his mother had taught him. Introducing his son to the causes that mattered most. Building a foundation of compassion and service that would guide George throughout his life. It was the most important thing he could do as a father, more important than any academic education or royal training. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was equally moved by the public reaction. She had encouraged William in his plan to take George to the passage. She understood the importance of exposing their children to different experiences, of teaching them that privilege came with responsibility. Together, she and William had worked hard to give George, Charlotte, and Louis as normal an upbringing as possible while still preparing them for their future roles. This was not always easy. The children grew up in the spotlight, their every move documented by the press. They attended a prestigious school where their classmates came from wealthy and powerful families. They lived in beautiful homes and had access to resources that most children could only dream of. But their parents had made a conscious effort to balance this privilege with perspective. They talked to their children about those who were less fortunate. They involved them in charitable activities. They modeled the behavior they wanted their children to adopt. The visit to the passage was the most visible example yet of this parenting philosophy in action. But it was far from the only one. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras, William and Catherine had been preparing their children for lives of service since they were very young. They had read them books about helping others. They had encouraged them to think about those in need. They had answered their questions honestly and thoughtfully, even when the topics were difficult. George, as the eldest, had received the most intensive preparation. William understood that his son's future was different from that of other children. George would one day be king. He would inherit not just a crown but a platform, an influence, a responsibility to serve millions of people. The decisions George made, the causes he championed, the way he treated others, all of these things would have an impact far beyond anything most people could imagine. This was a heavy burden for a young person to carry. William knew from his own experience how overwhelming it could feel to know that your entire life had been mapped out before you were born. There were moments growing up when he had wished he could just be normal, when the weight of expectation had felt crushing. His mother had helped him through those moments. She had reminded him that being royal was not about what you had to do but about what you could do. The crown was not a burden but an opportunity. An opportunity to help people, to make a difference, to use your voice for good. William had passed this perspective on to George. He did not want his son to feel trapped by his destiny. He wanted George to embrace it, to see his future role not as a limitation but as a gift. And bringing George to the passage had been part of that effort. It was a way of showing George that being royal could mean something beyond ceremonies and state dinners. It could mean putting on an apron and helping prepare food for homeless people. It could mean sitting down with someone who had nothing and treating them with dignity and respect. It could mean continuing a legacy of compassion that had been started by a grandmother George never got to meet. In the days following the visit, George thought a lot about what he had experienced. At school, he went about his normal routine, attending classes and playing sports and spending time with friends. But, in quiet moments, his mind kept returning to the passage. He remembered the faces of the people he had met there. The staff who worked so hard to help others. The volunteers who gave their time without expecting anything in return. The visitors who came seeking help and found something more: community, dignity, hope. He also thought about his grandmother. Before the visit, Diana had been a somewhat abstract figure in his mind. He knew she was important. He knew people had loved her. He knew his father missed her terribly. But she had died so long before he was born that she had never felt quite real. She was a face in photographs, a subject of documentaries, a name attached to memorials and awards. But signing his name next to hers in that visitor's book had changed something. For the first time, George felt a genuine connection to Diana. He understood that she had not just been a princess who posed for pictures. She had been a person who cared deeply about others, who had worked to make the world better, who had passed her values on to her children so that they could continue her mission after she was gone. George found himself wanting to learn more about his grandmother. He asked his father questions about what she had been like, what she had believed in, what she had done with her life. William answered as best he could, sharing memories that were both precious and painful. He talked about Diana's warmth, her humor, her ability to connect with anyone she met. He talked about her determination to use her position for good, even when it put her at odds with the traditional expectations of the royal family. He talked about how much she had loved her sons, how she had tried to give them a normal childhood despite their extraordinary circumstances. These conversations brought father and son closer together. George began to understand his father in new ways, to see him not just as a parent but as a person who had experienced loss and grief and had found ways to move forward. William, in turn, was moved by his son's curiosity, by his genuine desire to understand not just Diana's public image but her private self. Meanwhile, the staff at the Passage were preparing for their Christmas lunch. The donations that had come in following the royal visit had exceeded all expectations. They had enough money now to expand their services, to help more people, to make a bigger difference. But they also understood that money alone was not enough. Real change required sustained attention, ongoing commitment, a willingness to keep working even when the cameras were gone. The Christmas lunch was a tradition that the Passage had maintained for decades. Every year, they served a full holiday meal to people who would otherwise spend Christmas alone. The menu featured all the traditional dishes: roast turkey and stuffing, Brussels sprouts and carrots, Yorkshire pudding and gravy, mince pies and Christmas pudding. For many of the guests, it was the best meal they would eat all year. But, more than the food, what mattered was the sense of belonging. For a few hours on Christmas Day, people who had been marginalized and forgotten were welcomed into a community. They were treated not as problems to be solved but as human beings deserving of celebration. The preparations for this year's lunch were particularly meaningful given the recent royal visit. The vegetables that George had helped chop would be part of the meal. The decorations he had helped hang would brighten the room. His contribution, though small in the grand scheme of things, was a symbol of something larger. It showed that people from all walks of life could come together to help those in need. On Christmas Day itself, the Passage was filled with warmth and joy. 150 guests sat down to eat together, served by staff and volunteers who had worked hard to make everything perfect. There were no royals present that day. The visit by William and George had been carefully timed to avoid overshadowing the event itself. But their presence was felt nonetheless. People talked about the young prince who had come to help. They expressed gratitude for the attention that had been brought to their cause. They felt, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that the world had not forgotten about them. Back at home, the Wales family celebrated Christmas with their own traditions. There were presents and festive meals, games and laughter, the kind of ordinary family joy that exists in homes across the world. But this Christmas felt different for George. He found himself thinking about the people at the Passage, wondering how they were spending the day, hoping that the lunch was going well. He mentioned this to his father during a quiet moment. William smiled and told George that this was exactly what Diana would have wanted. She had always believed that compassion was not something you turned on and off. It was a way of seeing the world, a habit of thought that stayed with you always. She had taught William to notice those who were struggling, to remember them in his prayers and his plans, to let their faces linger in his mind as a reminder of the work still to be done. George was beginning to develop this same habit. The visit to the Passage had opened his eyes in ways he was still processing. He noticed homeless people on the streets now in a way he had not before. He thought about the stories behind the statistics, the individual human beings who made up the numbers that flashed across news reports. He wondered what he could do to help, what difference one person could make, even if that person happened to be a prince. These questions would stay with him as he grew older. They would shape the causes he chose to champion, the speeches he gave, the initiatives he launched. But, for now, in the winter of his 12th year, George was simply beginning. He was taking the first steps on a journey that his grandmother had begun decades ago, a journey that his father had continued, and that would now be his to carry forward. In the weeks following Christmas, George returned to his regular life. School resumed, with all its demands on his time and attention. He had lessons to attend, homework to complete, friends to see, sports to play. The intensity of the visit to the Passage faded as the routines of daily life took over. But something had changed, a fundamental shift in how George understood himself and his place in the world. His teachers at Lambrook noticed a subtle difference in his demeanor. George had always been a conscientious student, but now there seemed to be a new depth to his engagement. When discussions turned to social issues, he listened with particular attention. When opportunities arose to help others, he volunteered readily. It was as if the experience at the passage had awakened something in him that had been dormant before. The school itself had a strong tradition of community service. Students were encouraged to participate in volunteer activities, to think beyond their own comfort and consider the needs of others. George threw himself into these opportunities with newfound enthusiasm. He helped organize charity drives. He participated in programs that connected students with local organizations. He became known among his peers as someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. His parents watched this development with pride and hope. They knew that George faced enormous pressures as the future king. He would spend his entire life under scrutiny, his every action analyzed and debated. There would be those who criticized him no matter what he did. There would be moments of doubt and difficulty, times when the weight of expectation felt unbearable. But they also knew that George had something precious to guide him. He had values that ran deeper than any crown or title. He had a compass that would always point toward compassion and service. And he had the example of his grandmother, a woman who had shown the world that being royal could mean something beautiful and powerful and transformative. Diana had died before she could see her grandchildren grow up. This was one of the great tragedies of her early death, the experiences she was denied, the milestones she would never witness. She would not see George learn to walk or speak his first words. She would not hear about his first day of school or celebrate his birthdays with him. She would not be there to offer advice when he faced challenges or encouragement when he succeeded. But, in another sense, Diana was present in George's life in ways that transcended physical presence. Her spirit lived on in the values she had passed to William, which he in turn had passed to his children. Her legacy was visible in every act of kindness George performed, every moment of compassion he showed. She was there in the quiet prayers George offered for those in need, in the questions he asked about how to help, in the determination he felt to use his position for good. The visitor's book at the passage now held 3 signatures on that single page. Diana, William, George. 3 generations connected by a thread of compassion that stretched across decades. It was a powerful symbol of continuity, of values that endured beyond individual lifetimes. And it was a promise, made silently by a 12-year-old boy, to honor what his grandmother had started. The media attention from the visit eventually faded, as media attention always does. New stories emerged to capture the public's interest. Other headlines pushed the royal visit from the front pages. But the impact of that December morning continued to ripple outward in ways both visible and invisible. At the passage, the surge in donations and volunteers had a lasting effect. The charity was able to expand its services, reaching more people in need. New programs were launched to prevent homelessness, to intervene early before people lost their housing. The visibility brought by the royal visit translated into tangible improvements in the lives of real people. For Prince William, the visit reinforced his commitment to continuing Diana's work. His Homewards initiative, launched in 2023, was gaining momentum. The program focused on 6 locations across the United Kingdom, working with local partners to demonstrate that homelessness could be ended. The goal was ambitious but achievable. With the right combination of resources, expertise, and political will, it was possible to make homelessness rare, brief, and unrepeated. William had faced criticism when he first announced Homewards. Some questioned whether a prince who owned multiple properties was the right person to lead a campaign against homelessness. Others doubted whether real progress could be made on such an intractable problem. But William had learned from his mother that meaningful change required persistence in the face of doubt. Diana had been criticized too, told that her work was not appropriate for a princess, warned that she was stepping outside her proper role. She had persisted anyway, and the world was better for it. Now William was doing the same thing. He was using his platform to draw attention to homelessness, to bring together the organizations and individuals who could make a difference, to change the public conversation about what was possible. And he was teaching George to do the same, to see his royal position not as a barrier to involvement but as a tool for change. The relationship between father and son deepened in the months following the visit. They talked more openly about difficult topics. They shared moments of reflection about Diana and what she had meant to both of them. William began to see George not just as a child to be protected but as a young person coming into his own, someone who would one day stand where William stood now. George, for his part, gained a new appreciation for the life his father led. Being Prince of Wales meant more than attending events and shaking hands. It meant carrying the weight of expectations from millions of people. It meant trying to make a difference while being criticized from all sides. It meant honoring a legacy while also forging your own path. George saw all of this more clearly now, and it made him respect his father even more. The bond between them was strengthened by their shared commitment to continuing Diana's work. They talked about future visits to the Passage and other charities. They discussed the issues George found most compelling, the causes he might want to champion as he grew older. William offered guidance without being prescriptive, recognizing that George needed to find his own way just as William had found his. Catherine was an equal partner in these conversations. She brought her own perspective on charitable work, shaped by her experiences before and after joining the royal family. Her focus on early childhood development complemented William's work on homelessness, both of them understanding that many social problems were interconnected. They modeled for their children what it looked like to work together toward common goals while maintaining individual areas of focus. Charlotte and Louis, though younger, were also part of this family culture of service. They accompanied their parents to appropriate events and were included in discussions about helping others. The Wales household was not one where charity was a formal obligation performed in public and forgotten in private. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant thread connecting their privileged existence to the broader human community. For George specifically, being the eldest meant being first in many things. He was the first to experience the more intensive preparation for royal life. He was the first to take on public engagements that marked his growing maturity. And he was the first of his generation to visibly continue Diana's charitable legacy. This position came with pressure, but George seemed to handle it with grace. His demeanor at public events was composed but warm. He could engage with adults in conversation without seeming precocious or overly rehearsed. He showed genuine interest in the people he met and the causes he learned about. Those who interacted with him came away impressed by his combination of youthful energy and emerging seriousness. The visit to the Passage had been a turning point in this development. It marked the moment when George stepped more fully into his role as a member of the royal family dedicated to charitable work. Before, his public appearances had been largely ceremonial, occasions to wave and smile alongside his parents. Now, he had done something substantive. He had worked, learned, and contributed in a meaningful way. This shift was noticed by royal watchers and the general public alike. People began to pay closer attention to George, curious about the young prince who had put on an apron and helped prepare food for homeless people. They wondered what kind of king he would become, what causes he would champion, how he would use his enormous platform. These were questions without immediate answers. George was still a child, with years of growing and learning ahead of him. He would make mistakes along the way. He would face challenges that would test his character and his commitment. The path from where he stood now to the throne was long and uncertain, full of twists that no one could predict. But the foundation had been laid. In a visitor's book at a homeless shelter in central London, 3 signatures testified to a legacy that would endure. Diana had shown the way. William had continued the journey. And now George had taken his first steps on the same path. The story of those 3 signatures spread widely in the weeks following the visit. It became a symbol of something larger than any individual royal appearance. It represented continuity in the face of change, values that persisted across generations, a family legacy that was not about wealth or power but about compassion and service. People who had followed Diana during her lifetime found comfort in seeing her work continue through her grandson. They remembered the impact she had made, the lives she had touched, the way she had transformed the public understanding of what royalty could mean. And they saw in George the promise that her spirit would live on, that the causes she had championed would not be abandoned, that her vision for a more compassionate monarchy would be realized. For those too young to remember Diana, the story of George's visit offered an introduction to her legacy. They learned about a princess who had broken barriers, who had held the hands of AIDS patients when such contact was considered dangerous, who had walked through minefields to draw attention to the suffering they caused, who had insisted that her sons understand the realities of poverty and homelessness. Through George's actions, they came to understand Diana's values. The connection between past and present was powerful and moving. It showed that death was not the end of influence, that what we do and who we are can echo through time in ways we never anticipate. Diana had not lived to see her grandson born, but her impact on him was profound nonetheless. The lesson she had taught William had been passed to George, creating a chain of compassion that stretched across decades and would continue into the future. This was perhaps the truest measure of Diana's legacy. Not the monuments built in her honor or the documentaries made about her life. Not the countless articles written analyzing her impact or the awards given in her name. But this, a 12-year-old boy in an apron, working to help people in need, carrying forward values that had been planted by a grandmother he never knew. George did not understand all of this yet. He was too young to fully grasp the historical significance of what he had done, the way his small actions fit into a larger story that had begun before he was born. He simply knew that he had spent a morning doing something that felt right, that his father and grandmother had done the same thing before him, and that he wanted to do more. That simple knowledge was enough. It was the beginning of a lifetime of service, the first chapter in a story that would be written over decades. The world would watch as George grew up, as he took on more responsibilities, as he moved closer to the throne that would one day be his. And they would remember this moment, this December morning when a young prince signed his name in a visitor's book and connected himself to a legacy of love. Diana would have been proud. William knew this in his heart, felt it with certainty despite the years that had passed since her death. His mother had always hoped that her grandchildren would carry forward what she had started. She had never had the chance to tell them herself, to hold them in her arms and whisper in their ears about the importance of compassion. But her message had reached them anyway, transmitted through William, embedded in the fabric of their upbringing. And now it was visible to the world. In photographs and videos, in news reports and social media posts, in the 3 signatures on that visitor's book page. Diana's legacy was alive, growing stronger with each generation, reaching further than she could ever have imagined. The passage would continue its work, helped by the attention and resources the royal visit had brought. Homeless people would receive meals and shelter and support. Lives would be changed, futures altered, hope restored. And, somewhere in the midst of all that good work, the memory of a princess would persist, her spirit present in every act of kindness that followed from what she had started. George returned to his normal life, but he was not the same person who had woken up on that December morning. He had been changed by what he experienced, transformed in subtle but significant ways. The world seemed different to him now, more complex and more connected. He understood things he had not understood before, felt responsibilities he had not felt before. This was exactly what Diana would have wanted. Not for her grandson to carry a burden of guilt about his privilege, but for him to see that privilege as an opportunity, a platform, a chance to make a difference. She had taught William this lesson, and now it had been passed to the next generation. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. George had decades of life ahead of him, countless opportunities to build on what had started at the passage. He would grow and learn and change. He would face challenges that would test his commitment. He would have to find his own way, make his own choices, define for himself what kind of king he wanted to be. But the foundation was solid. The values were strong. The legacy was secure. And, somewhere, beyond the reach of time and space, a grandmother was watching over her grandson with love and pride. The 3 signatures in the visitor's book would remain there, a permanent record of a moment that meant more than anyone could say. Diana. William. George. 3 names written in ink, but representing something written on hearts. A promise to care for those who had nothing. A commitment to use privilege for service. A legacy of love that would never die. And, so the story continued, one generation passing the torch to the next, the flame of compassion burning bright through the darkness of indifference. This was Diana's gift to the world, the greatest thing she had ever done. Not the glamour or the headlines or the fairy tale romance. But this, the values she instilled in her sons, which they were now instilling in their children, which would be instilled in generations yet to come. The world was better for it. And it would continue to be better, as long as there were those willing to carry forward what Diana had started. In Prince George, that willingness was clear. He had seen, he had learned, he had been changed. And now he was ready to make his own contribution to a legacy that would never end. The winter months passed, and spring arrived with its promise of renewal. The daffodils bloomed in the gardens of Windsor, painting the landscape in cheerful yellow. Birds returned from their winter travels, filling the mornings with song. And, in the heart of the British royal family, conversations continued about how best to build on the momentum created by George's visit to the passage. Prince William had always taken a strategic approach to his charitable work. He understood that one-off visits, while valuable for raising awareness, were not enough to create lasting change. What was needed was sustained effort, consistent attention, and the willingness to stay engaged even when the cameras moved on to other stories. This was a lesson he had learned from watching various charity initiatives succeed and fail over the years. The Homewards program was the embodiment of this philosophy. Launched in June 2023, it represented William's most ambitious effort yet to tackle homelessness. The program operated in 6 locations across the United Kingdom, each chosen for its unique characteristics and challenges. In each location, Homewards brought together local organizations, government agencies, businesses, and community members to develop tailored approaches to preventing and ending homelessness. The locations included Aberdeen in Scotland, where the focus was on addressing the particular challenges of rural homelessness. There was Belfast in Northern Ireland, working to support young people aging out of care who were at high risk of becoming homeless. Sheffield in England was tackling family homelessness, while Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole concentrated on helping single adults rebuild their lives. Newport in Wales addressed housing supply issues, and Lambeth in London worked on preventing homelessness before it started. Each location received up to £500,000 in funding from the Royal Foundation, but the money was only part of the support Homewards provided. The program also offered access to expertise, connections to other organizations working on similar issues, and the convening power that came with royal patronage. William himself visited each location regularly, meeting with local leaders, hearing from people with lived experience of homelessness, and using his platform to draw attention to the work being done. This was the context into which George's visit to the passage had fit so perfectly. The younger generation was now visibly engaged in the same cause that William had championed for years. It sent a message about the long-term commitment of the royal family to addressing homelessness. It showed that this was not just William's personal project but a family legacy that would continue regardless of who sat on the throne. George himself was eager to learn more about Homewards and the broader effort to end homelessness. In conversations with his father, he asked detailed questions about how the program worked, what challenges it faced, and what success looked like. William was impressed by his son's genuine curiosity and took time to explain the complexities involved. He told George about the different pathways that led people to homelessness. Some people lost their housing due to financial crises, unexpected job losses, or medical emergencies that made them unable to pay rent. Others struggled with mental health challenges or addiction that made it difficult to maintain stable housing. Young people aging out of foster care often found themselves with nowhere to go, lacking the family support networks that most people took for granted. Domestic violence forced many women and children to choose between dangerous homes and no home at all. Understanding these different pathways was crucial to addressing homelessness effectively. A single approach would not work for everyone. What helped a young person leaving care might be very different from what helped a family facing eviction. Homewards emphasized this tailored approach, encouraging each location to develop solutions that fit their specific circumstances. George listened and absorbed this information with the seriousness it deserved. He was only 12, but he was being prepared for a life of public service, and part of that preparation involved understanding the issues that would demand his attention. His father did not talk down to him or simplify things excessively. He trusted George to grapple with complexity, and George rose to meet that trust. The spring also brought discussions about George's future education. He was in his final years at Lambrook School, which educated children through year 8. Soon he would need to move on to secondary school, and the decision about where he would go was a subject of much speculation in the media and among royal watchers. The most obvious choice was Eton College, the prestigious boarding school that both William and his brother Harry had attended. Eton had educated generations of royal and aristocratic boys, and its proximity to Windsor made it a practical option. William had fond memories of his time there and believed it had prepared him well for his future responsibilities. But there were other possibilities being considered. Catherine had attended Marlborough College, a co-educational school in Wiltshire, and some reports suggested she was interested in sending George there. The idea of George attending a mixed school would be a departure from tradition, but William and Catherine had shown throughout their parenting that they were willing to break with tradition when it served their children's best interests. Whatever school George ultimately attended, his parents were determined that his education would include more than academic subjects. They wanted him to continue developing the values they had worked so hard to instill. Community service, compassion for others, understanding of privilege and responsibility. These were not things that could be taught in a classroom, but they could be modeled, discussed, and reinforced through experiences like the visit to the passage. George's siblings, Charlotte and Louis, were also growing up with these same values. Though younger, they were already participating in age-appropriate charitable activities. The Wales family made a conscious effort to include all 3 children in discussions about helping others, adapting the conversations to each child's level of understanding. Charlotte, at 9 years old, showed a particular interest in environmental causes. She asked questions about climate change and what could be done to protect the planet. Her parents encouraged this interest, seeing in it the seeds of future commitment. Perhaps one day Charlotte would champion environmental causes the way her father championed homelessness awareness. Louis, the youngest at 6, was still too young for serious discussions about social issues. But he was learning the basics of kindness and sharing, the foundation on which all charitable impulses were built. His parents knew that the values instilled in earliest childhood would shape the person he became. The spring brought another significant moment for the royal family. April marked the anniversary of Prince William's birth, a time that always prompted reflection on how much had changed over the years. William was now in his early 40s, a father of 3, the heir to the throne. His life had taken him from a shy young boy to a confident public figure with a clear sense of purpose. On his birthday, William spent time with his family before attending to royal duties. In quiet moments, he thought about his mother and wished she could see what he had built. Diana would have loved her grandchildren fiercely, would have delighted in their personalities, would have been endlessly proud of the people they were becoming. He thought particularly about George and the visit to the passage. That morning in December had been one of the most meaningful experiences of William's life as a father. Watching George engage so naturally with the staff and volunteers, seeing him sign his name next to Diana's in the visitor's book, knowing that another generation was taking up the family commitment to service. These were moments that made all the difficulties of royal life worthwhile. William shared some of these reflections with Catherine, who understood completely. She too felt the weight of Diana's absence, especially when it came to their children. She would have loved to know her mother-in-law, to learn from her, to see how she interacted with William and Harry as young boys. Instead, she could only piece together Diana's legacy from stories, photographs, and the profound impact she had left on the world. Catherine's own approach to charitable work had been shaped in part by what she learned about Diana. She admired Diana's ability to connect with people from all backgrounds, to make everyone feel seen and valued. She tried to bring that same quality to her own engagements, focusing less on ceremony and more on genuine human connection. Her work with early childhood development was a natural extension of this philosophy. Catherine believed that the earliest years of a child's life were crucial in determining their future well-being. By investing in early childhood, society could prevent many of the problems that plagued people later in life, including some of the issues that led to homelessness. In this way, her work and William's were deeply connected, 2 parts of a larger effort to create a more supportive society. George, Charlotte, and Louis were often present when their parents discussed their charitable work. These were not formal lessons but natural conversations that occurred around the dinner table or during family time. The children grew up understanding that their parents cared deeply about helping others and that this caring was central to what it meant to be part of the royal family. As spring turned to summer, the anniversary of Diana's death approached. August 31st was always a difficult day for William and Harry, a day when the world remembered their mother and they were reminded again of all they had lost. In the decades since Diana's passing, the brothers had found different ways of coping with this annual milestone. William typically spent the day privately with his family, remembering Diana and talking to his children about their grandmother. He shared stories from his childhood, describing Diana's warmth and humor and the way she made him feel unconditionally loved. He showed them photographs and answered their questions as best he could. George was particularly interested in learning more about Diana during this time. His experience at the passage had awakened something in him, a desire to understand this woman whose legacy he was being called to continue. He asked his father about Diana's charity work, about the causes she had championed, about what had driven her to dedicate so much of her life to helping others. William answered these questions thoughtfully, trying to convey not just what Diana had done but why she had done it. He explained that Diana had felt a deep connection to people who were suffering. She had experienced her own struggles with mental health, with loneliness, with feeling misunderstood. These experiences had given her empathy for others who were going through difficult times. Diana had also believed that the royal family had an obligation to be relevant, to address the real issues facing society rather than remaining isolated in palaces and formal ceremonies. She had pushed boundaries, visiting AIDS patients when the disease was still stigmatized, walking through active minefields to draw attention to the suffering they caused, speaking openly about her own struggles at a time when mental health was rarely discussed. These actions had been controversial at the time. Some had criticized Diana for stepping outside the traditional role of a princess. But her willingness to take risks had ultimately transformed how the royal family engaged with the public. She had shown that royals could be advocates, could use their platforms to raise awareness and drive change. George absorbed all of this, adding it to his growing understanding of his grandmother's legacy. He began to see Diana not just as a historical figure but as a model for what he himself might become. She had used her position to make a difference, and he could do the same. The summer brought its usual round of royal activities, holidays, and family time. But, woven through these normal experiences was an ongoing conversation about service and responsibility. George was no longer content to be a passive observer of his parents' charitable work. He wanted to be an active participant, to do more of what he had done at the passage. William and Catherine discussed how best to respond to this enthusiasm. They wanted to encourage George's charitable instincts while being careful not to overburden him with adult responsibilities. He was still a child, after all, with the right to enjoy his childhood. The challenge was finding the right balance between nurturing his developing sense of purpose and allowing him space to simply be young. They decided on a gradual approach. George would continue to accompany his parents to selected charitable events, with opportunities to engage meaningfully but without excessive pressure. Behind the scenes, he would learn more about the issues his family cared about, preparing for the day when he would take on his own formal role in public life. This preparation was not just about charity work. George was also learning about the broader responsibilities of the monarchy. He attended occasional official events, practicing the skills of public engagement that would be essential throughout his life. He met dignitaries and learned how to hold conversations with people from diverse backgrounds. He watched his father navigate the complex demands of royal life and absorbed lessons about duty and dignity. Through it all, the memory of the visit to the passage remained vivid in George's mind. It had been a defining experience, a moment when theory became practice and abstract values became concrete actions. He looked forward to returning there, to seeing how the Christmas lunch had gone, to meeting again the staff and volunteers who had welcomed him so warmly. That opportunity came sooner than expected. In the early autumn, William arranged another visit to the passage, this time without the cameras that had documented their previous appearance. He wanted George to have an experience that was not shaped by media attention, to see the charity's work in its everyday form rather than during the heightened activity of the holiday season. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, dressed casually and without the security presence that often accompanied royal visits. Mike Clark met them at the door, surprised but delighted to see them again so soon. He led them inside, showing them parts of the building they had not seen during the Christmas visit. George was struck by how different the atmosphere was from December. Without the holiday preparations, the focus was entirely on the daily work of helping people. He saw the breakfast service in operation, volunteers serving hot meals to people who had nowhere else to go. He visited the health clinic where staff provided medical care to those who could not access mainstream services. He learned about the housing programs that helped people move from the streets to stable accommodation. Throughout the visit, George asked questions and listened carefully to the answers. He talked with some of the people who had come to the passage for help, hearing their stories directly. These conversations were sometimes difficult. The stories included hardship, loss, and struggle that George had never experienced in his privileged life. But they also included hope, resilience, and gratitude for the support the passage provided. One conversation in particular stayed with George. He spoke with a man in his 50s who had been homeless for several years before finding help at the passage. The man talked about the events that had led to his homelessness, a combination of job loss, divorce, and depression that had spiraled beyond his control. He talked about the shame he had felt, the sense that he had failed at life, the difficulty of asking for help. But he also talked about the transformation that had occurred since he came to the passage. He was now in stable housing, with a part-time job and regular support for his mental health. He volunteered at the charity several days a week, giving back to the organization that had helped him. His life was not perfect, but it was infinitely better than it had been. George was moved by this story and by the man's willingness to share it. He thanked him for his openness and said he hoped things continued to go well. The man smiled and said that meeting the young prince had made his day. He remembered seeing Diana on television when he was young, remembered admiring her kindness and compassion. To see her grandson carrying on her work meant more than George could know. After the visit, George was quieter than usual on the drive home. William gave him space, knowing that his son was processing what he had experienced. Finally, George spoke. He said he understood now why his grandmother had been so loved. He understood why his father had dedicated so much of his life to this cause. He understood that the numbers on news reports, the statistics about homelessness, represented real people with real stories. People who deserved help and dignity and hope. William felt a surge of emotion at his son's words. This was exactly what he had hoped would happen. George was developing the perspective that would make him not just a king but a good king. A king who understood his people, who cared about their struggles, who used his position to make their lives better. The autumn continued with school and royal duties, with family time and public appearances. George settled back into his routine at Lambrook, but something had shifted in him. His teachers noticed a new maturity, a seriousness of purpose that went beyond his years. His friends saw him paying more attention to news about social issues, asking questions they had never thought to ask. At home, George continued to discuss homelessness and other challenges with his parents. He wanted to understand not just the problems but the solutions. What was being done? What more?